This story began in the office of the Xing Long Company, where the skyscrapers of Yin City pierced the leaden sky. Our hero, Chen, stood as if chained to the floor while a storm raged within him. Injustice burned his soul. The project he had suffered through sleepless nights, the project that had become a part of him, was being denied association with his name, depriving him of the right to the commission he deserved. Boss Zhang Jinyan, with an icy smile on his lips, casually let slip the following phrase. Everything that Yang Chen creates rightfully belongs to the company, and the company is him, Zhang, and his will is the law here. Yang Chen's fingers clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms, as if trying to hold on to his slipping sense of self-worth. The boss's words hit him right in the chest, knocking the wind out of him. Without a moment's hesitation, he began furiously shoveling his things into the cardboard box. His colleagues, forming a worried semicircle around him, whispered warnings. They knew how much power Mr. Zhang wielded, and they reminded him of his paralyzed father whose life depended on his salary, as if trying to keep him from the brink of collapse. They also begged him to think about the girl, how she would look at him if he returned home unemployed. But Yang Chen, raising his head and looking at them with firm determination, snapped, he would become a driver until he found a decent position. His parents, when they left him a house and a car. That would be enough to keep him from breaking down and losing himself. With the box in his hands, he walked down to the dreary service parking lot where the air smelled of gasoline, rust, and the bitter taste of defeat. As he walked toward his car, cutting through the silence with his heavy steps, his phone vibrated in his pocket, piercing the silence like a lightning strike. It was on that fateful day that the girl decided to end their relationship with a faceless message. She was tired of waiting for a better life. She was leaving to follow her dream. Yang Chen frantically dialed her number, his fingers shaking, the screen blurring with anger and pain, but the answering machine coldly informed him that the subscriber was unavailable. This day turned into a black hole, swallowing up all his dreams and plans. But life, indifferent to his suffering, continued its inexorable run, and gathering the remnants of his will into a fist, Yang Chen got into his car, feeling the cold leather of the seat digging into his back, reminding him of reality. The thought of the romantic candlelit dinner I had booked for the evening kept swirling around in my head. The taxi app beeped loudly, notifying me of a new order a kilometer away. Yang Chen sped towards the parking lot exit, his tires squealing in protest at the rush. Once he got there, he immediately called the client to let her know he was there, but all he heard in response was a grumpy female voice. She needed another 20 minutes for the cream to fully absorb into her skin, as if time existed only for her. Unable to contain his anger, Yang Chen shouted into the phone, demanding to know why she'd even ordered so early. The girl, however, kept her cool and retorted that she'd almost finished her makeup, and that if the driver dared cancel the order, she'd immediately file a scathing complaint against him. His patience snapped, and, angrily pressing the cancel button, he ended the call. The complaint was not long in coming. The passenger, without mincing words, described him as the worst driver she had ever encountered, accusing him of rudeness and unprofessionalism like a brand that would forever remain on his profile. And suddenly the whole world around exploded with a blinding light that momentarily burned the retina, turning reality into shining chaos. Right inside his car, as if materializing from this light, a beautiful girl appeared and rushed towards him, and Yang Chen froze, unable to comprehend what was happening, as if time had stood still. This mysterious diva, without pausing to catch her breath, blurted out that the host had been located and all connection conditions had been met. Now the driver was in for an unexpected reward for the bad review he'd just received, as if fate itself had decided to play a strange game on him. Yang Chen looked at her, not understanding anything, his brain refusing to process this absurd information, trying to find even a grain of logic in what was happening. The girl, carefully enunciating every word, explained that the system was ready to reward him immediately after confirming the link, and what's more, every time he received a negative review, a new reward awaited him. It could be money, property, luxury cars, or even unique skills, opening doors to a world he never dreamed of. Hearing about such opportunities, young Chen, forgetting all his troubles, enthusiastically shouted to be connected immediately. At that very moment, the girl pressed her lips to his, and the connection was made as if an electric discharge had passed through his body, awakening powers he had not suspected. The bad review system clearly instructed that rewards should be awarded to passengers who appear suspicious or behave inappropriately, although Chen was still able to provide quality service and collect good reviews to maintain his overall driver rating, balancing on the edge between light and dark. Since the complaint had already been received, the system instantly awarded him 28% of the shares of the All-Island Hotel Group, making him the second largest shareholder of this powerful hotel empire. The system invited him to the hotel, promising that the share transfer agreement would soon be delivered to him, as if opening the gates to a new life for him. The power of this system was astounding. It distributed such colossal gifts immediately after the binding, as if testing whether he was worthy of such power and whether he could hold it in his hands. Before Chen could even comprehend the scale of what had happened, a new order appeared in the app, right outside the All-Island Hotel. He instantly realized that this order was created especially for him, so that he could personally come to the hotel and pick up the documents for receiving the shares, and without hesitation, he pressed the Accept button. An elegant passenger was already waiting for him at the hotel's majestic entrance, her silhouette clearly outlined against the neon lights, like a predator ready to pounce. She slid quickly into the salon and slammed the door with a loud click, cutting herself off from the outside world and trapping them in a tight space. The car took off, cutting through the night city. On the way, the girl, casting a displeased glance, made a sharp remark to the driver. She categorically did not like the fact that he was constantly peeking at her in the rearview mirror, as if violating her personal space. Chen, trying to remain calm, began to explain that he was not watching her, but the road behind him, and involuntarily added that apparently she herself had never sat behind the wheel and did not understand the intricacies of driving, inadvertently hurting her pride. She took his words as a personal insult and, flushing, declared that he himself was an inexperienced and very slow driver. After these words, he pressed the gas pedal almost to the floor, and the car rushed forward. The passenger became frightened and began to scream, her voice merging with the roar of the wind coming through the cracks in the windows. She started apologizing and saying she was wrong, her words flowing like a stream, trying to smooth over the rough edges she had created. Wang Jai, trembling all over, begged the driver to slow down, her voice shaking, revealing genuine fear. At such a speed she was very scared. It seemed as if the world outside the window had merged into one continuous strip, depriving her of a sense of security. As if going crazy, Chen shouted that only if they didn't get into an accident could she leave here alive, but he could let her go if she called him Dad, turning the situation into an absurd nightmare. In tears, Wang Javis began to scream, "Daddy! Dadu!" Her voice was filled with despair and fear. Since she was a good girl, Chen decided to slow down, and the car gradually slowed down its mad rush, returning the world to its usual outlines. Just then, they arrived at the All-Island Hotel, and the girl was able to step out, finally feeling solid ground under her feet. After getting out of the car, she tearfully promised him that she would leave a bad review and a complaint, and then call the police to have him arrested for dangerous driving. Very soon, Chen received a congratulatory message for completing the mission based on negative reviews. The system rewarded the driver with the financial company Xing Lun. He was required to visit the company's office the next day to receive a transfer letter, a real estate deed, and other documents, as if handing him the keys to a new world. It was the same company where he had worked before, and now Chen had the opportunity to settle the issue with his former boss. The next day he came to the company office, his steps sounding firm and his eyes full of determination. The first person he saw at the reception was that same passenger, her face distorted with surprise, as if she had encountered a ghost from a nightmare. Wang Jai thought the driver was following her. Her eyes widened in fear and her fingers gripped the edge of the counter. But young Chen smiled slyly and said that he had already taken his place here a long time ago, his voice sounding confident. The girl at the reception informed him that his seat was at table number 8 and the company staff would show him there. She also handed him the share agreement and asked him to keep it. Young Chen walked proudly to his table, his back straight and his steps. The waitress announced that his food would be ready soon. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that passenger Wang Jai walked past him to the next table. It seems that it was a blind date, and she met a certain Zhang Lui. Young Chen sat casually sipping his coffee, his posture expressing complete calm, as if everything that was happening was just another chapter in his life. And just at that moment, Mr. Li entered the door with his young companions. Chen Xin recognized one of the visitors and decided to go over to say hello. Her steps were light, but there was a hidden tension in them. She walked up to Yan Chen and began to speak indignantly about how she and Zhao Fei had already broken up, thinking that he was following them to interfere. Her voice rang with indignation. But he calmly replied that he was not that low and that he was not interested in such girls, and since they liked spending time with men over 40, he simply felt sorry for their parents. Chen Xin was deeply indignant at his words. Her face turned red and her fist clenched, revealing the storm of emotions raging inside her. Suddenly, Mr. Li appeared behind her and asked what happened. His voice was quiet, but there was a threat in it that could freeze the blood. But she tried not to show it and said that everything was fine. Her smile was forced, and her eyes darted around, giving away the lie. Mr. Li saw that the conversation between his companion and her friend was not going well, and, rubbing his fists, asked who this guy was, his posture expressing readiness for action. Young Chen replied that he was Fei Fei's ex-boyfriend, and that they had just broken up today, and at the same time, he wanted to know when the two had slept together, since it was clear that they were lovers. His words hit the mark, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Mr. Li asked the girl if it was true. His gaze was heavy, like a stone, ready to crush everything in its path. Fei Fei burst into tears and began to say that they had broken up a long time ago. But she didn't expect that he would follow her to this hotel and intimidate her. Her tears were a mixture of fear and guilt. Mr. Li began to calm his companion and say that he would deal with this guy himself. His voice was firm, and his intentions were clear. He threateningly told Yan Chen that he was annoyed that he was pestering his girlfriend, and his words carried a threat that was impossible to ignore. Mr. Li ordered the waitress to call Manager Cheng for a talk, his tone brooking no argument, turning the situation into a formal confrontation. Fei Fei asked Yan to leave because she assured him that he would get into trouble. Her voice was full of anxiety, and there was a pleading look in her eyes. Wang Jai was sure that he would not be able to get out of this now. A barely noticeable smile touched her lips, as if she was anticipating the fall of her enemy. Her companion, frowning, asked if she knew this man, and Wang Jai, slightly lowering her eyes, replied that he was just the driver of the taxi she had arrived in. Wang Jai, nervously fiddling with the edge of the tablecloth, explained that he had a truly monstrous character. He had almost killed her with his reckless driving, made her tremble with fear and call him Daddy before he let her out of the car. And as soon as he stepped onto the sidewalk, she, without thinking, left him the most devastating review she could think of. Hearing this, Zhang Lui jumped up from the table with a bang. His face contorted with rage, and he began to shout that he would teach this insolent man a lesson that he would never forget for the rest of his days. Wang Jai rushed towards him, grabbing his sleeve and begging him not to be so impulsive, her voice trembling as if she herself was afraid of the consequences of this outburst of anger. But Zhang Lui, without listening to her, still approached Yan Chen, his steps echoing in the hall like hammer blows, and sharply asked if it was true that he had bullied the girl he had come on a date with. Young Chen, without changing his expression, calmly confirmed this as if it was something ordinary, and added that he did not see the slightest problem in this. Zhang Lui, flushed with indignation, demanded that Yang Chen immediately apologize to the girl for whom he came here today. Otherwise, he said, he would throw him out of this establishment with his own hands, regardless of the consequences. Yang Chen continued to calmly sip his coffee, as if all this noise did not concern him at all, and then, slightly tilting his head, asked who, in fact, his interlocutor's father was. It turned out that his father was the chairman of Tianmu Investment, and he was planning to invest a huge amount of money in All-Island Hotel Group. Zhang Lui proudly added that if he asked to blacklist Yan Chen, no one in the company would dare say no, because such investors don't expect rejection. Yang Chen laughed and, putting the cup on the table, asked to show how they could do it. At that moment, the manager was already rushing towards their table, his face expressing a mixture of anxiety and obsequiousness, and his steps were quick but careful, as if he were treading on thin ice. He bowed slightly and began to ask Mr. Li why he had not informed them in advance of his arrival for dinner. And when his gaze slid across the room and he noticed Zhang Lui, he froze for a moment, and then, as if trying to turn the tension into a compliment, he declared that it was simply a wonderful day for their hotel, as if the presence of these two influential people was a reward in itself. Mr. Li, without hiding his irritation, explained that today was his girlfriend's birthday, and they had decided to have dinner there, but their evening was ruined because her ex-boyfriend did not allow them to eat in peace, intrusively interfering in their conversation. He directly asked Mr. Chen to get rid of this man, like an annoying fly. Zhang Lui immediately supported him, passionately recounting how he had bullied his companion in the taxi, his voice ringing with indignation, and his fists clenching and unclenching, revealing his inner tension. Mr. Chen, trying to save face, wanted to find out who was so reckless as to insult two such influential guests at once, his gaze darting between them, searching for at least a drop of understanding. And then everyone turned to look at Yan Chen at once, and there was something ominous in this unified movement. The manager froze for a moment, his eyes widening as he finally recognized the quiet man as the new shareholder who had just been announced at an internal meeting. Without wasting a second, he abruptly ordered the security guards to immediately throw Mr. Li and Zhang Lui out of the hotel and never let them in again, his voice sounding like a sentence that did not allow for any argument. The two, stunned, began to remind the manager that they were not just guests, but important suppliers of products for the hotel and future investors whose money could change the fate of the entire chain. But Manager Qing firmly reiterated that Mr. Yang Chen was the second largest shareholder in the All-Island Hotel Group, and his word here now carried more weight than all their contracts combined. This information stunned everyone, and a ringing silence hung in the hall as everyone tried to comprehend the scale of the changes that had just befallen their familiar world. Wang Jai listened to all these words, and her mind refused to believe what was happening. How could the second-largest shareholder end up behind the wheel of a taxi? But now it became clear to her why he had acted with such arrogant confidence. Meanwhile, Manager Chung loudly announced that the hotel no longer needed Mr. Li's services or the Zhang Lui family's investments. His words sounded like a final verdict, nullifying all previous agreements. Fei Fei, realizing the full scale of her mistake, bitterly regretted breaking up with this guy, and a desperate hope flared up in her soul that it was not too late to ask him for forgiveness and get everything back. Falling to her knees in front of Yan Chen, she burst into tears and began to assure him that she had nothing to do with Mr. Li, that she had always belonged only to him, and now she was ready to do anything, if only he would look at her with warmth again. Chen Xian also did not stand aside. She contemptuously called her friend a terrible woman obsessed with the thirst for money and, stepping forward, begged Yan Chen to pay attention to her, emphasizing that she was still pure and worthy of his attention. Yang Chen, watching this scene, began to suspect that these two women were about to start a real fight, and a hint of irony flashed in his eyes. Mr. Li, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, began to make excuses to young Chen, muttering that he didn't know Fei Fei was his girlfriend. Otherwise, he would never have dared to confront him, his voice sounding pitiful and uncertain. Jan slammed his mug down on the table, the sound echoing throughout the room. He shouted loudly at Manager Chen, wondering why these people were still here, his voice cold and sharp like a knife blade. He, instantly understanding the hint, urgently called security to immediately remove them from the hall. His movements became quick and nervous, as if he was afraid of being late. Mr. Li and Chen Xin desperately resisted, trying to justify themselves to the last, their voices merging into a chaotic chorus full of fear and despair. Manager Cheng leaned over to young Chen and quietly whispered in his ear that Zhang Long, the son of the chairman of Tianmu Investment, was still in the room, as if warning him of the last threat that had yet to be neutralized. Without batting an eyelid, Jan confidently replied that as long as he was here, the hotel didn't need this family's investment, and with a mocking smile asked what the manager was so afraid of and why he hadn't kicked him out yet. Manager Cheng, mustering all his resolve, ordered the security to get rid of Zhang Long, as well as blacklist him and never allow him to set foot in any hotel of their group again. Zhang Long, hearing this, began to shout that no one should dare to touch him with their hands, his voice trembling with anger and humiliation. In desperation, he suggested that Miss Wang leave the place as quickly as possible and dine in another, more respectable establishment where she would be treated with due respect. Yang Chen noticed how persistently this guy was clinging to his companion, and a daring idea instantly formed in his head: to steal her right before his eyes, to see how Zhang Long would cope with this blow to his pride. He called out to Wang Jiayi. His voice was soft, but there was a steely confidence in it that couldn't help but attract attention. Quickly plucking a small but graceful flower from the pot, he held it between his fingers as if it were the key to her heart. Turning to her, he calmly offered to sit down and talk. He sincerely felt that his jokes in the car had frightened her greatly, and now he wanted to sincerely apologize in order to erase this unpleasant aftertaste. Wang Jiayi thought for a moment, weighing the pros and cons. This was a blind date with rich and powerful people, and perhaps it would really be more beneficial for her to choose someone more promising. But something in his gaze made her heart tremble, and she decided to give this guy a chance to make amends, hoping that this decision would not be her biggest mistake. Seeing this, Zhang Long became furious. He had been feuding with this man for so many years because of women, and now she had insulted him so much by choosing someone he despised. To his furious indignation, Wang Jai coldly replied that he had started this fight not for her sake, but for the sake of his own face, and she had never asked him to rush to defend her honor, risking everything. Gritting his teeth until they cracked, Zhang Long muttered that if he was not allowed to touch young Chen, then he might as well hit Wang Jai herself, and if she dared to sit next to this man, she would be in trouble she couldn't even imagine. Putting his hand on her shoulder, Yang Chen quietly but firmly said that everything was fine, his touch was light, but there was an unshakable strength in it that could protect her from any storm. Now she could sit and eat peacefully without having to worry about threats, and if that annoying fly dared to bother her, Yang Chen promised to get rid of it once and for all. His words not sounding like a threat, but like a calm promise. Hearing this, Zhang Long lost control of himself and raised his fist, intending to hit the girl and prove that no one dared to talk to him like that. But Yang Chen intercepted his hand with lightning speed, his movement so fast and precise that it seemed almost unreal. After all, no one dared to beat a woman, he muttered through his teeth, and these simple words contained such an unyielding morality that any force retreated before it. Manager Chung immediately shouted at the security guards to throw the trash out of the room, his voice rising to a scream, betraying the pent-up tension. Zhang Long, retreating under the pressure of the guards, shouted that he would tell his father everything, that this injustice would not go unpunished. But his words were already lost in the noise of the hall. A tense silence gradually settled over the establishment. broken only by the quiet clinking of glasses and the sound of red wine pouring into them, which seemed almost black in the semi-darkness of the room. Now Chen decided to formally introduce himself to Wang Jai, as if erasing all previous misunderstandings and starting their story from scratch. In response, she quietly said that she would delete her bad review and they could start over, as if hoping to erase that horrible episode in the car from her memory. But Chen gently but firmly replied that there was no need to do that. A bad review would serve as a special reminder of their unusual meeting, of how something new could be born out of chaos and misunderstanding. The melodic clink of glasses rang out, and this sound seemed to seal their new union, turning awkwardness into a solemn moment. The other guests of the establishment, whispering and casting curious glances at them, were perplexed as to how this man had managed to ask for a date with the girlfriend of the man who had just tried to fight him. At this time, Wang Jai, having relaxed a little, wanted to find out what Chen's family was doing, hoping to find at least something in his past that would help her better understand this contradictory man. He calmly told me that his parents had died several years ago and now he was just a taxi driver. The girl, slightly lowering her eyes, said that she was originally from the city of Su, now worked in a luxury store, and since she was determined to stay in this city, she had to go on blind dates, hoping to one day meet someone who would understand her aspirations. Yang nodded thoughtfully and noted that, compared to Feifei, Wang Jai seemed surprisingly sincere, and then added that everyone had the right to strive for a better life and that a woman wasn't at all ashamed to rely on a man if there was trust and respect between them. To these words, they decided to drink, raising their glasses in silent agreement, as if sealing an unspoken agreement between two lonely souls. Wang Jai carefully sipped some wine, and the tart taste of the drink slightly burned her throat, awakening new, long-forgotten feelings in her. The alcohol gradually took its toll. She loosened up and, letting her guard down, explained why she'd been so prejudiced against him when she got into the car. It turned out she'd had 2 blind dates that day. The guy she'd dated before had been quite nice, but he'd tried to kiss her while they were at the movies, making her wary of any male advances. Chen, slightly tilting his head, suggested that most likely she simply didn't like the guy. Otherwise, she might not have been against the kiss. His logic was simple, but disarming. But Wang Jai was adamant that no one kisses on the first date. Her interlocutor had a different point of view. He believed that, given the right atmosphere, much more could be done on a first date than just kissing, and his words did not sound arrogant, but rather confident, that true feelings do not tolerate artificial boundaries. Chen stood up silently, and in that movement there was not just determination, but the cold, honed strength of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted without further ado. He walked up to Wang Jai, and every step he took echoed faintly in the hall, as if the silence itself was listening to what was about to happen. Gently pulling her towards him, he kissed her right on the lips, not as a request, but as an affirmation, as if erasing all the previous boundaries between them. And then he turned around, tossed a bon appetit over his shoulder, and calmly said that he was going to rest in room 1280. His voice sounded so ordinary, as if he had just ordered a cup of coffee and not exploded her entire inner world. The girl remained standing, stunned, in shock, and she herself did not understand why she did not resist this kiss. She clearly understood that the guy had deliberately named the room number, challenging her. But she was even ashamed to think about it, because somewhere inside, the thought of succumbing to this madness was already maturing. Chen was already in his room. He had stepped out of the shower wearing only a towel, and the humid air of the room still carried the scent of hot water and tense anticipation. Suddenly there was a sharp knock on the door which sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the room, causing him to freeze for a moment. When he opened the door, Wang Jai stood on the threshold, her eyes burning with a mixture of fear and determination, and her breathing ragged, as if she were running not down the corridor, but through a storm of her own doubts. She immediately threw herself on his neck and pressed her lips to his, as if trying to quench a thirst that she could not explain even to herself. The girl couldn't find the words to express what was happening to her. And then she languidly exhaled that she was burning up, and this whisper sounded like an admission of defeat before her own feelings. Yang Chen knew she was drunk, but she could already feel his 8-pack abs under her fingers, and she couldn't help herself. Her hand slid over his skin, as if checking to see if he was real. Picking her up in his arms, Yang Chen quietly asked her not to blame him for what was happening, since she had started it herself. He kicked the front door, and it slammed shut with a dull thud. Within a minute, the guest found herself on the snow-white sheets of his bed, and all her previous rules and fears crumbled. The next morning, the sun shone mercilessly and brightly into the hotel room, bathing everything in golden light. And upon waking, young Chen realized with cold clarity that the girl had already left, leaving behind only the faint scent of perfume and the feeling of something irrevocably changed. He slowly rose from the bed, and his gaze involuntarily slid over the sheets, where traces of their stormy night were still visible. He understood that for her this was the first time. And on the nightstand nearby lay money and a note, their presence simultaneously absurd and piercingly honest, as if she were trying to buy herself the right to this escape.
The first thing he did was pick up a scrap of paper. Wang Jiayi had written that the boy had done a good job the previous night and that she was very pleased, and the money on the table was his service fee. She asked him not to go out this month to gather his strength, and when she was paid next month, she would return to tuck him in for the night.
Yang Chen found this girl more than just intriguing. She was a mystery he wanted to unravel again and again. That afternoon, he went to the Henglong Financial Building, his steps on the marble floor now sounding different, not like the steps of an employee, but like the tread of a man returning to his rightful place. At the reception desk, he clearly stated his name and said that he had come to pick up his things, and these simple words sounded so confident that the girl behind the counter froze for a moment, as if she had heard an order, not a request. The manager immediately jumped up, shook his hand vigorously, and quickly muttered that he would get everything ready now. His movements were fussy, and his eyes showed a desire to please. The girls in the office whispered to each other, casting curious glances at him. The new boss turned out to be incredibly young, and they were incredibly curious about what changes were now in store for the company. Literally within a minute, everything was ready. The folders were neatly stacked, the documents were checked, and in this efficiency one could feel not just diligence, but an almost reverent respect. The manager said that all the documents were in a folder, but Mr. Yang could check everything. His tone was almost pleading, as if he was afraid that the slightest mistake would be fatal. But Yang Chen decided to trust his employees right away, because he really needed their help in running the company, and this trust was more powerful than any order. Manager Chen immediately asked the girls to come over and greet Mr. Yang, a gesture that conveyed the team's willingness to serve the new leader. They bowed obediently to the new boss, their movements synchronized, almost ritualistic, and then he let them go to work, and the hall again filled with the familiar hum of office life. Yang Chen's first question was about the people who rented the 15th floor, and his question didn't sound like idle curiosity, but rather the cold calculation of a man preparing to strike. The manager's hands began to tap rapidly on the keyboard, the keys clicking like gunshots, betraying his nervousness and desire to please his new boss. The tenant's name was Zhang Jinyan, and his contract was expiring at the end of this month, information that lay on the table like a card revealing all of the enemy's weaknesses. Yang Chen offered to come up and talk to them, and there was no question in that phrase, only a statement that foreshadowed a storm. The elevator quickly delivered them to the desired floor. Its movement was swift, almost impatient, as if the building itself was in a hurry to witness the coming denouement. Suddenly, Manager Cheng's phone rang sharply, piercing the silence of the cabin and causing both men to frown for a moment. The call was from a client about a rental. Yan calmly said he'd go first, and the manager could talk to the client calmly. His composure had an icy effect on those around him. When Yang entered the Xinglong Company office, all the employees were literally taken aback, their faces frozen in mute amazement, as if they had seen a ghost returning to deliver justice. The employees began to persuade him to return, their voices merging into a chaotic chorus. Some even wanted to speak with the boss personally, hoping to smooth things over. Yang Chen sternly demanded that Zhang Jinyan come out to him immediately, and this demand was not a request, but a sentence that could not be ignored. He didn't keep us waiting. The former boss quickly left, his face flushed with indignation, and he immediately began shouting that you can't behave like that in this office, as if trying to regain control of at least the tone of the conversation. The first thing Yang Chen did was ask coldly about his commission, and this question sounded like the crack of a whip, instantly sobering up everyone present. But the boss just shouted furiously at him to go to work and sign at least one contract a month, his voice trembling with tension, revealing his inner uncertainty. Yang Chen calmly reminded him that he had promised a 20% commission for the successful resolution of the case without any conditions, and every word he said fell like a heavy stone, destroying the former boss's flimsy excuses. But the boss only laughed mockingly in response, since Jan had no evidence, and in that laughter, one could hear the confidence of a man accustomed to getting away with it. Yang Chen firmly stated that everyone in the company had heard about this, and his gaze slowly slid over his colleagues' faces, as if urging them to remember the truth. The boss turned sarcastically to his employees and asked if they had ever heard anything about commissions. His smile was predatory, as if he had already seen his victory. But naturally, everyone answered no, and their voices sounded not so much like lies as fear of the wrath of a powerful boss. Jan was shocked and bitterly surprised that none of these people, whom he considered comrades, knew that his humiliation today could become their nightmare tomorrow. One of the employees awkwardly turned to Yang and said that Mr. Zhang was unusually kind to him, so he should hurry up and thank Mr. Zhang and get back to work. And these words did not convey sincerity, but the desperation of a person trying to survive in this system. The boss really liked Yang Chen's talent, so he decided to give him one last chance, and this chance did not feel generous, but rather calculated cruelty. After all, it wasn't easy for Mr. Zhang to support such a large number of employees, and he liked to remind people of this, turning his care into a tool of pressure. But John was deeply outraged by such shamelessness. He came to this job to receive money for his work, but they did not even give him what he honestly deserved, and this injustice burned him from the inside like a hot coal. After these words, the boss abruptly ordered the door to be closed, and this order contained a threat that sent a chill down the employees' spines. One of the employees did so immediately, and the dull click of the lock sounded in the room like the sound of a trap slamming shut. The manager, who had been standing in the corridor the whole time, was a little puzzled by what was happening and even wondered if everything was okay with the boss. His head was swarming with anxious thoughts, foreboding an approaching storm. Mr. Zhang, lowering his voice, told Yang that only if he deleted the recording would he let him go, and there was a desperate attempt to save face in this deal. He grabbed one of the monitors with his hand, his fingers digging into the plastic, betraying the tension within him. And then he threw it with all his might onto the floor, and it shattered into pieces, the fragments flying in all directions like symbols of crumbling order. Mr. Zhang wanted to blame it all on Yan, but he was calmly recording on his phone, and every second of this madness was recorded with merciless precision. With all the data stored in the cloud, Mr. Zhang's plan had failed miserably, and the realization of this defeat was slowly but surely washing over him like a heavy wave. One of the staff members nervously suggested that they first beat up Yan Chen and then delete the recording. And this idea conveyed the desperate, almost animalistic cruelty of people driven into a corner. Suddenly, someone knocked insistently on the office door, and this knock sounded like an alarm, breaking the tense silence. It was Manager Chen. Mr. Zhang asked irritably why he had come himself, as he was just about to go down to discuss the lease extension, and his tone betrayed the irritation of someone interrupted from an important matter. But Manager Chen calmly replied that he had come to see Mr. Yang and ask if he was okay, and in those simple words there was an unexpected, almost touching concern. Mr. Zhang didn't even immediately understand who they were talking about. His mind was still clouded by anger and attempts to find a way out of the situation. And then Manager Chen firmly said that this was the new boss of their company. And these words fell into the room like a stone into a quiet pond, causing ripples of shock. He apologized to Yan Chen for being late answering that call, and the apology was not formal but genuinely regretful. Mr. Zhang asked incredulously what the manager meant by new boss, his voice a mixture of disbelief and growing horror. Manager Chen confidently explained that Mr. Yang had paid $2 billion for the building and was now its rightful owner, controlling every floor and every fate connected to the place. This news shocked not only Mr. Zhang, but also the rest of the company's employees. Someone even suggested that there had been some kind of mistake and that Yan Chen was simply the namesake of the building's new owner, and this suggestion carried a hint of desperate hope that the nightmare would now end. But Manager Chen was absolutely certain of this information, and his calm confidence acted on everyone like an ice-cold bucket of water, washing away any illusions. Mr. Zhang instantly turned pale and began to apologize, declaring that he was ready to bear any punishment for his behavior, his voice trembling and his posture becoming pathetic and humiliated. He even offered to double Jan's salary, as if trying to bribe his silence and favor, but there was no longer any pride in this offer, only desperation. Manager Chen clarified whether Mr. Yang actually worked for the company and was still owed money. Yang calmly confirmed this information, and there was no malice in his agreement, only cold justice. Manager Chen sternly reminded Zhang Jinyan that their contract clearly stated that they were required to act in good faith in accordance with the law, otherwise the company had the right to terminate the contract and demand triple the rent. Mr. Zhang had apparently forgotten this clause, and now this forgetfulness was turning against him. And after these words, Yang Chen calmly turned on the recording of the conversation on his phone, and the voice of his former boss, full of threats and insults, sounded in the room, turning into his own verdict. Mr. Zhang, in a panic, began to plead for the past to be left in the past and promised to pay 3 times the commission just to settle this conflict and preserve at least the remnants of his influence. But Yang Chen coldly replied that he only wanted what was due to him, not a penny more, and in this restraint one could sense the strength of a man who had nothing to prove. As he left the matter to Manager Chen, trusting him to deal with the consequences, and that gesture spoke louder than any words. But Zhang Jinyan didn't want to give up. His pride wouldn't allow him to simply accept defeat, even when all his cards were on the table. He blocked Jan's path and asked him heatedly why he wanted to get rid of him, since he had already admitted his defeat, and no one knew how life would turn out tomorrow, as if trying to find at least one loophole for salvation. But Yang Chen was the kind of man who never left his enemy any way out. There was no pity or doubt in his eyes, only a cold determination to see things through. Mr. Zhang tried to discuss this with Yang again, but there was nothing left to talk about. All the words had been said, all the cards had been laid bare, and there was no point in continuing this dialogue. In an attempt to somehow get out of this situation, Zhang Jinyan desperately offered 50,000 yuan to any of his employees who could help him out of this situation, and this promise sounded like the panic of a man clutching at straws. But in response, there was only a ringing silence, heavy and meaningful, as if the room itself condemned his proposal. He promised anyone who simply took away Yan Chen's phone 100,000 yuan plus double their salary, and this desperate move was tinged with utter desperation and loss of control. But the staff merely exchanged silent glances, making it clear that his words were no longer trustworthy, and there was more contempt in that silence than in any insults. At this time, Manager Chen calmly took out his phone, his movements confident and measured, as if he knew in advance that this moment would come. He ordered the building's security to slowly ascend to the 15th floor, and the order carried a finality that heralded the end of a long and painful game. 10 minutes later, everyone was already on the floor, and the air here seemed thick with tension. Every step of the guards echoed heavily, as if the building itself was frozen in anticipation of the outcome. Some people thought that Zhang Jinyan had insulted manager Cheng, and this thought flashed through the ranks like lightning, causing people to look at each other warily, as if they were standing on the edge of a cliff. When all the security was in place, the manager, standing up to his full height and looking straight ahead, asked who would dare touch Mr. Yang now. At this time, Zhang Jinyan began to break out in a cold sweat, realizing the gravity of the situation. His power had crumbled like a house of cards, and he felt the ground slipping from under his feet. Yang Chen also left the decision of this issue to the manager, being confident that he would handle it well. He also loudly announced to the company's employees that Zhang Jinyan no longer had power, and they all had to return what they were owed before he went bankrupt completely. The employees immediately recalled how the boss had forced them to work overtime without paying them, how he had forced them to sign dubious contracts, and these memories flared up in their minds like smoldering embers, flaring into a flame of righteous anger. He also deducted money from their salaries without reason. Even his right-hand man, Li Yuan, was now throwing stones at the boss, and this betrayal felt less like a personal insult than a shared disappointment in the man they had once trusted. Well, now that power was in the hands of Chen, this was an excellent chance to report him, and thoughts of retribution that could finally happen began to flash through the employees' minds. After everything that had happened, the doors of the Xinglong company were sealed, and this seal lay on them like a seal of judgment, finally closing an old chapter. As Zhang Jinyan was carrying away his last belongings, Yang calmly reminded him that it was his own fault. There were laws in this world, and no one could do whatever they wanted just because they held the title of boss. Yang Chen announced to the former employees of the firm that he was going to open an advertising agency in the office, and asked if anyone wanted to work there. Immediately, shouts were heard from those who wanted to help, their voices merging into a single chorus of hope, as if people had finally seen the light at the end of a dark tunnel. But Li Yuan was refused. After all, he was Zhang Jinyan's loyal slave, and the shadow of betrayal still lay on him, making him unworthy of this new beginning. But he fell to his knees and, clenching his fists, begged to be accepted, promising to go to court and file a complaint against Mr. Zhang, his voice trembling with despair and his eyes full of tears. But Yang Chen was adamant and firmly said that he would refuse him employment under any circumstances. There was no cruelty in his words, only a firm conviction that some bridges were better left unbuilt. And raising his voice slightly, he told him to get the hell out, and this phrase sounded like a final verdict, leaving no room for argument. In 2 weeks at the most, everyone else could return to work. From now on, management of the company was handed over to Zhu Xiaoli, so everyone could contact her directly if they had any problems. It was time for everyone to simply take a vacation, go home, rest, and then wait for the notice to return to normal operations. These words sounded like a long-awaited breath of fresh air. Zhu Xiaoli was very surprised that she was appointed as a manager. She had no experience and was afraid that she might mess everything up. Her eyes widened with excitement and her hands trembled slightly. But Yang Chen calmly replied that it was normal to be inexperienced when you were just starting out. All the company's employees sincerely thanked their new boss. Their voices sounded warm and sincere, and their eyes shone with hope for a better future. And they said goodbye to him before his company began operations. And in this farewell, there was a sense, not of parting, but of anticipation of a new chapter. Yang Chen walked down to the building's parking lot, his steps confident and firm. It was time to get to work, and he was ready for any challenge. 500 meters away from him, a new order appeared, and the signal flashed on the screen like a beacon, showing him the way forward. And Yang Chen rushed forward, his movements swift and precise, as if he had once again found his true calling. 2 passengers were already waiting for him, and their silhouettes against the bright sun seemed part of some new, unexpected turn of fate. One of them was Wang Lixin, his college friend, and the encounter struck his memory like a flash of lightning, bringing back long-forgotten images. And it was no coincidence. Fate itself seemed to have arranged this meeting to remind him of the past that he had tried so hard to forget. The girl opened the door and got into the car. Her movements were light, but there was a hidden tension in them, as if she, too, felt the weight of this unexpected meeting. She, too, immediately recognized young Chen, and for a moment their gazes met, and in that silence the years that separated them flashed by. The girl introduced him to her boyfriend, Zhang Jiangkun, and with a touch of pride told him that the driver was her classmate at university and that he was the best student at the time, not to mention how handsome he was. Zhang Jiangkun nodded, confirming that this guy was very popular with the girls, and his tone was filled with respect for the man who once outshone everyone around him. Wang Lixin confirmed that many girls liked him, but he already had a crush, and there was a subtle bitterness in this remark, as if she still remembered the pain of rejection, and she decided to clarify whether they were going to get married. Her question sounded easy, but there was a hidden meaning in it, as if she was checking how deep his feelings were then. Yang Chen stepped on the gas and the car moved off smoothly, and he calmly said that they had broken up. There was no drama in these simple words, just a statement of fact that no longer hurt him so much. His passenger sincerely regretted that he had rejected so many girls for the sake of that one, and now they were not together, and there was a quiet sadness in her voice, as if she was mourning not only his fate, but also her own unfulfilled dreams. Yang Chen suddenly remembered that Wang Lixin was one of those he had rejected, and this thought pricked his conscience like a forgotten shard of glass. But she only smiled and said that she was grateful that he had publicly rejected her. She believed that she would now live a miserable life with him, and this bitter irony sounded like bitter medicine that needed to be taken. Wang Lixin quietly told the boy how Yang Chen had humiliated her after she confessed her love to him, and there was no accusation in those words, only an acknowledgement of an old wound that still sometimes ached. But so much time had passed that he himself had forgotten what he had said then, and if he had offended her in any way, he was ready to sincerely apologize. His voice sounded soft, and his gaze was full of remorse. Seeing that Yang Chen was a sincere guy, Zhang Jiangkun suddenly offered him a job in his company, and this gesture did not feel like pity, but rather genuine respect for his talent. He was the advertising campaign planning manager for Heiyun, and if Yang went to work for him, Wang Lixin could ask him to take care of him. But Yan politely but firmly declined the offer, stating that he enjoyed working as an online taxi driver and did not need an official job. Wang Lixin began to get upset because the driver opened the windows and didn't turn on the air conditioning. It was incredibly hot in the car, and her irritation flared up like dry grass from a spark. Yang Chen replied irritably that the order had not specified that the air conditioner be turned on, and, squinting slightly, added that the girl could say a few kind words to him and then he would turn on the air conditioner for her, or she could turn it on herself. The guy started yelling at the driver to turn on the air conditioning immediately. His voice rose to a screech, as if the hot air itself was pushing him toward hysteria, and sparks of impotent rage flashed in his eyes. The girl asked him not to be so impulsive, because the driver was behind the wheel of the car and they could have an accident. Her voice sounded less like concern than the tired irritation of someone who had already dealt with these outbursts of anger 100 times. Reminding him that they were old friends, the girl muttered a request to turn on the air conditioning, and then she would forget about the incident. Otherwise, she would write him such a bad review that his rating would collapse like a house of cards in a gust of wind. But Yan Chen wasn't intimidated by a bad review. He just chuckled to himself because the system was already turning these complaints into hard cash, and another round of negativity seemed to him not a curse, but a kind of blessing. Zhang Jiangkun finally lost his temper and began shouting at the driver to stop the car immediately. His voice broke into a hoarse roar in which one could hear not just anger, but a sense of the total injustice of the world. The brakes squealed loudly, a sound that cut through the air like a blade, causing time to freeze in a tense silence for a moment. Zhang Jiangkun was the first to exit the car, abruptly throwing open the door, and his girlfriend followed him out after a slight hesitation. He banged his foot on the driver's door, demanding that the driver get out, an answer for his rudeness. But he had no intention of doing so. He merely watched calmly as his passengers were now able to fully enjoy the scorching summer sun, as if it were their own little punishment for their lack of restraint. And, pressing on the gas, young Chen quickly drove away, leaving behind clouds of dust and a trail of bewilderment that stretched behind this story, like the trail of an airplane in the sky. Chang Jiangkun tried to catch up with him, waving his arms and shouting curses, but it was no use. The car had already disappeared into the stream of traffic, becoming only a vague silhouette in the distance. It was a bridge over a river, a place where the wind howled through the steel structures, and stopping was strictly prohibited. Calling another taxi here proved impossible, and they suddenly felt marooned on a desert island in the middle of the city. John Jiangkun nervously took out his phone, his fingers trembling with tension, and the screen seemed like the only island of control in this suddenly collapsed world. He decided to immediately file a complaint against the driver to get him fired, and he wrote every word in the message with special care, putting all his resentment and anger into it. For this bad review, the system rewarded Yan Chen with 2 million. He just thought how nice it was to be on the bridge in such heat, where the wind at least slightly dispersed the stuffy air, and this thought brought him a strange, almost childish satisfaction. In the general chat room of his classmates, Yang Chen saw a conversation where everyone was heatedly discussing his work as a taxi driver. The lines ran before his eyes, and they revealed that condescending curiosity that people have when they encounter something that goes beyond the boundaries of their usual world. He pressed hard on the gas, as if he wanted to leave behind not only the kilometers of road, but also all the gossip that clung to him like thorns. He sent a message in the chat. I quit my job a few days ago and now work for an online taxi service. If you're embarrassed to know me, then you should pretend you don't know me the next time you see me. He attached the recording from the car to the support team and also to the chat so they could finally hear the whole story, unadulterated and unedited. After this, everyone began to condemn Wang Lixin, and her name suddenly became the center of attention, like a target in a shooting gallery where everyone tried to hit with an apt word. She told Zhang Jiangkun about this, and her voice sounded less like resentment and more like the confusion of someone who had suddenly found themselves in the line of fire. And he promised to kill him. His eyes darkened with anger, and then he asked the girl to send a message to Yan Chen that she was inviting him to a party at the Hing Hotel on Sunday, in order to lure him in and make him look bad in front of the whole class, turning this meeting into a public humiliation. And Wang Lixin happily agreed to this. Her agreement was not tinged with malice, but with a desperate desire to regain her lost sense of control over the situation. Yang Chen read her invitation message, and the corner of his lips twitched slightly. He knew perfectly well that behind this gesture was not a sincere desire to see each other, but a carefully planned trap. But his answer depended on whether Yan Chen was in a good mood that day. Suddenly, it started to rain heavily, large drops hitting the roof of the car with a dull thud, and he thought about how those two, left on the bridge, were probably now soaking wet and cursing him, and for some reason this picture brought a slight, almost mischievous smile to his face. The taxi arrived at the right place, and the windshield wipers, desperately swinging, could barely cope with the streams of water, turning the reality behind the glass into a blurry, watercolor landscape. There should have been a passenger waiting there, but instead of a human figure, only a vague silhouette was visible, drowning in the gray shroud of rain. The client started complaining on the phone that she couldn't get to her car in such weather. Yang Chen took out an umbrella from the car, and he ran after Miss Zhang, his boots slipping on the wet asphalt. There was so much water on the ground that she couldn't walk on it. Her shoes seemed made for the catwalk rather than city downpours, and the very thought of contact with reality seemed almost blasphemous to her. But Yan Chen didn't have access to disability services, his app didn't list that option, and he had no intention of becoming a reluctant rescue hero. However, Miss Zhang's new, expensive shoes left her no choice. She looked at the puddles with horror, especially since so many people in her life wanted to carry her, but today, no one was in a hurry. Yang Chen was adamant. He handed her an umbrella and firmly said that with it she could easily walk to the car on her own, and there was not a drop of sympathy in his words. snatching the umbrella from the driver's hands. Miss Jiang called him a fool, and the word sounded like the crack of a whip, but Yang only shrugged. She opened her umbrella and walked to the car on her own, her gait tense, as if she were walking through a minefield, and every drop that landed on her shoes felt like a personal tragedy. Having sat down in the salon, the girl muttered that if he upset her like that again, he would receive such a review that even the system would not be able to compensate for it. The arrival point appeared ahead, a small sign barely visible through the veil of rain as if winking at them from the fog. Chen announced that they had arrived, his voice sounding matter-of-fact, like a verdict that would leave no room for appeal. Miss Jiang began to say again that she couldn't walk on the ground because it would dirty her shoes, and in her tone there was a hint not just of dissatisfaction, but an almost tragic realization that the world was not fair. The driver explained that it was a car, not a plane, and he couldn't get any closer, his words sounding like a dry statement of facts devoid of any sympathy. But his passenger didn't care. She kept demanding that he take her to her destination, otherwise he would receive such a bad review that he would disappear from the rating forever, and this threat was laced with confidence in her own impunity. She also refused to get out of the car until he lifted her up, and this request sounded so casual, as if asking strangers to carry her was a common thing for her. Chen pulled the key out of the ignition, and the quiet click sounded like the final chord in their protracted standoff. And getting out of the car, he calmly said that she could stay there as long as she wanted, and he would go get a bite to eat in the meantime. There was no irritation or anger in his voice, only the icy calm of a man who had finally stopped taking everything too seriously. In the meantime, he would go get a bite to eat, and this simple thought of hot food suddenly seemed to him the most desirable consolation on this crazy day. Miss Jiang threatened to sue him for such rudeness, and her voice rang with indignation, as if the very thought that someone dared to disrupt her plans was unbearable. As soon as she got out of the car, Chen quickly walked back, his steps light, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. And, slamming the door, he left the girl in the rain, and this sounded like a period at the end of a long and tedious chapter. And to top it all off, he also splashed her when he suddenly pulled away. Chen found it very funny that there were people in this world who sincerely believed that they deserved special treatment just because they had expensive shoes and a habit of dictating their terms to the whole world. His hand involuntarily reached for the thermos, and the feeling of warm metal under his fingers suddenly became the most pleasant moment of the whole day. But the tea in him had treacherously run out, as if fate itself had decided that even this drop of comfort should not be given to him for nothing. The system congratulated him again on receiving a bad review and complaint. Its mechanical voice sounded almost solemn, as if presenting a medal for his exceptional ability to irritate passengers. This time, he received 50 grams of Dahung Mother Tree Tea leaves as a reward. They were waiting for him in the trunk, carefully tucked into a box, like treasures from a forgotten legend. This was the kind of service Chen liked. Strange, absurd, but generously rewarding for all the humiliations, as if the world had finally begun to pay old bills. But such a small weight seemed strange to him, almost mocking, and then the system explained that this tea was more valuable than gold. Every crumb in it preserved the history of centuries and a taste that could not be bought for any money. The initial auction price for 20 grams exceeded 200,000, and now it was a rarity that even money couldn't buy, as if rarity itself had become a currency inaccessible to mere mortals. Chen was shocked by this information. His brain refused to reconcile the tiny bundle with the amounts that usually appeared in news reports about corporate deals. He got out of the car and looked into the trunk as if he expected to see something more than a modest package there. The price of this tea was 10,000 for one small package, a figure that now seemed not just money, but a measure of something almost mystical. This tea smelled very delicious. Suddenly, the system alerted him to another bad review. Now, he was entitled to a bonus villa in Vinjiang, and he had to stay home until the courier arrived with all the documents and keys. The villa in Binjiang in a coastal region where the waves whispered their secrets and the air was saturated with salt and luxury, was estimated to cost around $500 million. And the tea was truly delicious. And this contrast between the earthly aroma and the cosmic price suddenly seemed to Yang the most accurate metaphor for his new reality. Yang Chen put the thermos back, and he saw through the glass that Miss Zhang had approached him. Her silhouette in the reflection seemed unreal, like a mirage that was about to dissolve. She silently got into his car, and in this silence, one could feel not submission, but a strange, almost predatory determination, and she handed him a wad of money. The rustling of bills sounded like a challenge in the silence of the salon. Yang Chen reminded her that he wasn't a taxi, but an online car rental service, and she needed to book a ride on the platform. She needed to get out of the car and get into another one. But Miss Zhang started shouting at him not to talk nonsense and just drive the car, her voice ringing with hysteria mixed with the certainty that the world was obliged to obey her wishes. After all, today she wanted to ride in his car. This simple, almost childish whim suddenly became a matter of principle for her. Suddenly, through the side window, he saw an enraged man, demanding that the door be opened. His face was distorted with such rage that it seemed as if he could break the glass with his bare hands. Miss Zhang began screaming that if Yang dared open the door, she would bite the driver to death. Her voice broke into a shriek that sounded less like anger and more like panic. And she insisted that she didn't know the man from the outside, as if she were denying any connection with him, as if that could make him less real. Then Yang Chen asked the stranger if he knew the lady in his car, and the question didn't sound like curiosity, but rather an attempt to find some kind of support in this madness. And he started screaming that this was his girlfriend, and every word came out of him like a shot, filled with resentment and possessive anger. Miss Zhang screamed that she had met this man for the first time on a blind date and had never been his girlfriend. Her voice trembled, and in it one could hear not only a lie, but also a desperate attempt to save herself. The man insisted that the girl's father had sold her to pay his debts and that he had already booked a hotel, so he really didn't want anyone to spoil his mood. The girl screamed at the driver to think before handing her over to this man, as this could make him an accomplice. Her words were not just a request, but a plea for salvation. And he responded by screaming that it had nothing to do with him, and demanded that the door be opened, as if the whole world had to submit to his will. Yang Chen suggested that the girl call the police since he was just a driver and didn't want to get involved in a fight between them. His voice sounded calm, almost indifferent, like that of a man who had already seen too many strange things to be surprised by anything else. Miss Zhang was very irritated by his calmness. She wanted him to rush around, panic, do something, just so he wouldn't remain so calm. But the driver shouldn't have been protecting her, and again he suggested calling for help, as if he was offering the most logical way out of the situation, which she stubbornly refused to see. The man outside started kicking the car, and each kick echoed dully in the car, reminding us that reality was still here and that it was much harsher than we would like. He tried to rip open the door where the passenger was sitting, and the metal groaned under his pressure, as if it were protesting against this brute force. The girl again asked Yang Chen to save her, her voice no longer sounding like an order, but like a quiet, almost hopeless whisper. After all, even if the matter reached the police, her family still wouldn't have the money to repay the debt, and this simple, bitter truth hung in the air, heavier than any threats. The thug still managed to open the door and shouted for the girl to get out before he killed her right in the car. His words sounded like a death sentence that made the blood run cold. He even invited Ian to go with them to the suburbs, where he would let him play with this beauty after he finished himself. This phrase was so cynical and careless that it seemed more frightening than any direct threat. The driver shoved the key into the ignition, and this simple gesture suddenly became an act of resistance. He had no intention of becoming part of this nightmare. Zhang Hengji threatened the driver that if he dared to take the girl, he would still find him and kill him. His voice rang with rage, and in it one could hear the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way at any cost. But Chen didn't care who he was. At that moment, he was only concerned with one thing: how to get out of here before the situation got any worse. He stepped on the gas and left that idiot far behind, and the wind that rushed into the car seemed to wash away the remnants of this nightmare. But he wasn't going to leave it like that, and quickly took out the key to his car. His movements were sharp, almost convulsive, like those of a man who was driven into a corner. The girl thanked the driver for saving her, and her voice sounded not so much sincerity as relief mixed with disbelief. But he warned her that there was no point in complimenting her since she wasn't his type, and he would simply drop her off nearby so that she could get home in another taxi. His words didn't sound rude, but rather like a dry statement of facts, devoid of any pathos. Suddenly, a black foreign car blocked their way, its massive silhouette frozen across the street like an insurmountable wall. The driver inside was screaming that he would kill them if they didn't stop, and his voice, amplified by the speakers, sounded like a death sentence from which there was no escape. Miss Zhang screamed in panic at Yang not to stop under any circumstances, otherwise she would not live. Her screams were filled with a primal fear that blocked out any rational arguments. And he pressed the gas pedal with all his might, and the car jerked forward as if it wanted to escape from this trap. The pursuer's car almost fell over on its side, its wheels sliding helplessly on the wet asphalt. And this moment of absurd vulnerability suddenly brought a strange satisfaction. The girl rejoiced that he had crashed his car, and her delight was not so much joy as relief that broke through her fear. Arriving at the nearest stop, Ian shouted at her to get out immediately, his voice harsh, without a hint of sympathy. Miss Zhang began offering him her first time in exchange for him taking her home. Ian tried his best to explain that she wasn't living in a fairy tale and that she needed to get out of the car, his voice sounding tired, as if he was explaining the obvious to a child. She opened the door in irritation and called him a coward and a bastard, and these words thrown over her shoulder sounded like the final chord in their strange meeting. And she threw a bunch of curses at him, and they flew after her like a flock of angry birds. But Jan was no longer listening. Now it was worth thinking about the villa. The thought of it suddenly seemed like the only island of calm in this crazy day. The courier brought him the keys and documents and offered to take him to his new property after he parked his car. Very soon they were at the place. Jan only needed to bring a few clothes, and even this simple thought of changing his shirt suddenly took on special meaning. Suddenly the phone in his pocket rang, and this ordinary sound suddenly seemed like a signal from another reality. It was the secretary of the All Island Hotel Group, and he needed John to come to a meeting at the All Island Hotel headquarters at 15 o'clock. Upon arriving, Chen apologized for being a little late, and his words sounded sincere, even though he was still buzzing with adrenaline from the recent events. It was a great honor for him to meet the shareholders, and even in this phrase, one could hear not so much flattery as genuine surprise at how quickly life was changing. The others didn't even expect that their new shareholder was so young, and their looks showed curiosity mixed with slight distrust. They introduced him to Li Wanhong, the chairman of All Island Group, and his calm, confident look seemed to set the tone for the entire meeting. Also at the meeting was Zhang Wu, the investment boss of Sky Curtain, and the topic of their meeting was Sky Curtain's investment in All Island. Jan was puzzled by such investments. Once everyone had introduced themselves, Li Wanhong suggested getting down to business and said that he knew everything about what had happened between Yang and Mr. Zhang's son at the hotel. So he offered them a drink, a gesture that suggested an attempt to smooth things over without losing face. Mr. Zhang hoped that Yang Chen was not offended by the children's ignorance, and his words sounded less like remorse and more like a desire to maintain good relations. But he replied that his son had insulted him very much, and he could not simply forgive him. For the sake of their shared future, Li Wanhong asked Mr. Zhang to call his son to apologize properly to Mr. Yang, a request that hung in the air like thin ice, ready to crack at any sudden movement. After these words, the father lost his temper, because he believed that his son had done nothing wrong, but was simply defending his girlfriend, who was being bullied. His anger was not so much a defense of his son, but rather wounded pride. Yang asked Mr. Li if there were any other issues to be discussed at this meeting besides the capital injection from Sky Curtain Investment, but it turned out that there were none, and this emptiness suddenly made the situation even more tense. Then John decided to clarify his attitude to everyone present and expressed his agreement with this investment. His words sounded calm, but they conveyed the strength of a man who knows his own worth. And since he still had things to do, he decided to leave. And this decision was not one of haste, but of confidence that he had already said everything that needed to be said. Without saying anything else, he slammed the door, and the sharp sound sounded like a period at the end of a chapter. Mr. Zhang was furious, calling Yan a toxic person, and his words carried the resentment of someone accustomed to everyone adapting to him. He wanted to invest in their hotel, but they were getting in his way instead of trying to please him. Li Wanhong decided to return to the discussion of this matter later, and his calmness conveyed the wisdom of a man who knows how to wait. Mr. Zhang, having calmed down a little, nevertheless decided to talk to his son, and this step, albeit belated, indicated that even the proudest people are sometimes willing to compromise. Yang Chen walked back down to his familiar parking lot, and the familiar smells of gasoline and hot asphalt suddenly seemed almost like home to him. Taking out the key fob, he beeped the alarm, and this short sound sounded like a signal of returning to familiar reality. Suddenly he heard footsteps behind him, and this sound, so common at other times, now made him tense. He turned around and saw that same brute, but he was no longer alone. Next to him stood two strong guys whose faces expressed nothing but readiness for a fight. The brute reminded him that he had warned him that he would find him and kill him, and his voice did not sound like an empty threat, but rather the cold confidence of a man accustomed to seeing things through to the end. Yang Chen asked if he really wanted to fight him, and his question didn't sound like bravado, but rather one of genuine bewilderment. But now Zhang Hengji's target was the offender's car, which he was going to smash, and an almost sadistic pleasure from the upcoming reprisal was visible in his eyes. It was his buddies who began to hit the iron horse with clubs, and each blow echoed in Zhang's chest with a dull pain, as if they were hitting not metal, but his own hopes. Ian filmed all of this on his phone, and the camera lens seemed to create an invisible barrier between him and this madness. But Zhang Hengji said that it was unnecessary, since he had the money to pay. If Yang didn't have a car, he wouldn't be able to make a living, and there was a peculiar, almost perverse cruelty to this logic. Suddenly, a red car appeared in the parking lot, its bright color seeming almost defiant against the backdrop of the gray everyday life. Miss Zhang stepped out of the car, and her appearance was so unexpected that everyone froze for a moment. She started screaming that Zhang Hengji had gone crazy. She started asking why he crashed the car, since she had promised to stay with him overnight. And he just wanted to ruin John's mood for breaking his heart. And this simple, almost childish motivation suddenly made the whole situation absurd. And since the lady had fallen for the taxi driver, Zhang Hengji promised to kill her that evening. There was not a drop of bravado in his voice, only the icy, measured cruelty of a man accustomed to keeping his word. Miss Zhang reminded Zhang Hengji that her family only owed money to his family, and if it weren't for that damned debt, she would never have looked at him. At that moment, Zhang Lui appeared in the parking lot, his calm, almost detached appearance a stark contrast to the chaos that reigned around him. He asked what Yang had done to offend this girl, but it was a long story, as tangled as a tangle of poisonous snakes. Zhang Lui said that his father demanded that he apologize to Yan Chen, and this request was not so much a matter of personal will, as it was the cold calculation of a large family, accustomed to bringing everything into balance. This situation made Zhang laugh a lot. A bitter laugh escaped his chest. But in the midst of this absurdity, he suddenly came up with a plan. Clear, cold, and unexpectedly elegant. Yang asked if Zhang Lui's family was very rich, and he replied that they had multi-billion-dollar assets, saying it as casually as if he were talking about a couple of hundred yuan. He also knew Zhang Hengji. Between them hung that special, almost invisible bond of people from the same circle, where everyone knows each other, but not everyone likes each other. Yang Chen came up with a way for Zhang Lui to gain his forgiveness, an idea that combined business, morality, and subtle calculations that could change the balance of power. He tensed up a little and asked what he wanted, and in this question one could hear not so much curiosity as a cautious premonition that he was about to be drawn into a game whose rules he did not fully understand. Yang proposed that he lend money to Wang Qiani to pay off her debts and, in exchange, allow them to invest in All Island Hotel Group, a phrase that sounded like a chess move, seemingly simple but capable of turning the game around. But Zhang Lui asked why he didn't lend her the money himself, since he had shares worth more than 3 billion, and his voice carried the genuine bewilderment of a man confronted with someone else's logic. But Yang Chen was still working as a taxi driver. That simple phrase hung in the air like a mockery of all numbers and statuses, a reminder that the essence of a person is not always visible in his bank account. Zhang Lui decided that this guy was from some secret family that did not allow him to go out into the world, and this thought brought him a strange relief. It was easier to explain things that did not fit into the usual framework. Zhang Lui then asked the girl's father to send someone to their office in the morning to discuss the details, and this proposal conveyed a willingness to play by the new rules. Yang Chen told Miss Wang to bring someone to Sky Curtain Investment tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning to discuss the details of the debt. And Mr. Zhang, the president of Sky Curtain, had already agreed to this. The words sounded like a formal invitation to another world where debt and investment were currencies more important than money. In her joy, she jumped into his arms and hugged him tightly with her long legs, and this impulse was a mixture of gratitude, relief, and something else, an almost childish delight that the ground suddenly stopped slipping out from under her feet. Zhang Hengji thought the debt issue was some kind of joke, a cheap trick designed to confuse him, and this denial sounded like a last-ditch attempt to maintain control of the situation. Zhang Lui replied that he had nothing against him, but it was a matter of business. His voice sounded calm, emotionless, like that of a surgeon simply doing his job. Zhang Hengji was shocked to hear that the taxi driver was actually the second shareholder of All Island Hotel Group, and reality suddenly cracked at the seams, revealing the abyss between who he thought he was and who he actually was. Zhang Lui quietly asked if he himself couldn't see what was happening, and in that whisper one could almost hear sympathy for a man who had lived for too long in the illusion of his own power. At that moment, the thug dropped the bat from his hands, deciding that he had damaged the car of the son of some very rich family, and the heavy metal fell with a dull thud onto the asphalt, as if putting an end to his little war. His men began to worry, not knowing what they were getting into, and their eyes showed a primal fear of an unknown enemy that was too big for their size. Zhang Hengji took out a cigarette and lit it, and his trembling fingers revealed what he was trying to hide behind a mask of indifference. He asked Yan Chen why he hadn't told him that he was such a large shareholder, and then he would definitely not have allowed such a misunderstanding, and this question sounded not so much like a request for forgiveness, but rather a bitter realization of his own mistake. Yang Chen merely asked if he really thought everything in this world was that simple, and there was no malice in his words, only a tired statement of the fact that the world is much more complex than it seems. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the police appeared, sirens blaring, cutting the air like blades, and blue lights swirling in a mad dance, turning the parking lot into a scene from a nightmare. Miss Zhang began screaming that her friend's car had been smashed, her voice merging with the chaos, becoming part of the relentless stream of accusations and excuses. But in this situation, all the arrows converged on Zhang Hengji, and he suddenly found himself in the center of attention, like a target that everyone decided to shoot at once. The police immediately approached him to clarify all the circumstances, and their calm, confident movements contrasted sharply with his growing panic. He replied that his name was Zhang, and his father was Zhang Yaowu, the chairman of Yaowu Group, and Yang Chen had stolen his girlfriend, and he just wanted to teach him a lesson, as if mentioning his father's name would be a magical shield from any consequences. The policeman asked if he was prepared to offer compensation, and in this everyday question, one could hear the iron logic of a law indifferent to famous names. Zhang Hengji said that compensation was only possible after a court decision, and his answer was filled with the usual arrogance of a man accustomed to having all problems resolved later, and not by his own hands. The police officer reminded them that after the court's decision, this situation might no longer be rectified with money. And these words sounded like a cold bucket of water, sobering and merciless. And when he started talking about his father again, the policeman shouted that he didn't care at all. If he damaged someone else's property, he had to answer for it, and in this shout, one could hear the fatigue from endless attempts to hide behind big names. The big guy then offered Yan Chen 100,000 yuan, a figure that sounded like a desperate attempt to buy his way out of the situation. But Jan did not agree to a partial settlement and wanted to wait for the court's decision. His calm did not convey cruelty, but a firm understanding that justice cannot be sold in pieces. Zhang Hengzhi then offered him 200,000, thinking that it was quite enough for an old broken car, and there was a disdainful tone to this assessment that only strengthened Yang's resolve. But the victim demanded justice, and those two words summed up his entire story: years of humiliation, injustice, and waiting for the moment when the scales would finally tip in his favor. Chang was afraid of being prosecuted because he didn't need a job. He was just waiting to inherit, and that prospect suddenly felt like a prison. The police had no choice but to take him with them, and the handcuffs clicked with frightening regularity, erasing the last illusions of impunity. In the negotiation room, Yang Chen met with Zhang Hengji's father, who had come to negotiate with him about the car, and the tension in the air was thick and heavy, like before a thunderstorm. Father also thought that Jan was asking too much, but he had no intention of talking to them, because he was going to go to court, and in this firmness one could hear the voice of a man who had finally stopped bargaining for his dignity. Then he was offered a sum of 500,000, and the numbers that would have previously made his head spin now seemed like just pieces of paper. But Jan wasn't going to agree to it because for him it wasn't about the money. He wasn't fighting for compensation, but for the right to be heard. Zhang Hengji's father offered $1 million, and this sum, which could solve the problems of dozens of people, sounded almost like an insult in the silent room. Yang Chen asked the policeman if he could leave, and in that simple question, one could hear the desire to leave this theater of the absurd behind as quickly as possible. Just as he was about to sign the document and leave, Zhang Hengji's father stopped him, and this gesture revealed a last attempt to keep the situation under control. He suggested meeting at another time, since John was still young and there was no need to spoil his future path. And in these words, one could hear the confidence, familiar to the powerful of this world, that everything can be postponed, smoothed over and forgotten. Yang Chen asked if he had finished talking nonsense, and in that sharp question all the fatigue from the constant attempts to bribe, persuade, and silence him was evident. From the time he was 15 years old, he had been threatened by a large number of creditors, and these threats were his first school in teaching him not to be afraid of loud words. So these threats had no effect on Yan. They were just an echo of the past, which he had long ago learned not to hear. So the next meeting had to be in court, and that thought brought a strange, almost cold satisfaction. Yang Chen walked to the real estate office, and every step he took now sounded like a hammer hammering nails into the lid of his old life. The pretty girl handed over the keys with almost reverent care, as if she were handing over not just metal and plastic, but a pass to a new life, and asked if he had any ideas about the price. There was a slight tension in her voice, like someone afraid to upset the delicate balance of the deal. But he agreed with the market price. His calm nod sounded like a seal, sealing the agreement without further ado. The house was to be handed over to Yan Chen, and if he needed anything, he could always go to the office. This phrase hung in the air like an invisible insurance policy, a promise of support in a world where you could only rely on yourself. Now he needed to buy a car as soon as possible because working as a taxi driver couldn't be put off. It wasn't just a way to earn money, but an anchor that kept him in a reality where everything was changing too quickly. Suddenly, the phone in his pocket rang, and this familiar sound in the silence of the empty office sounded almost like an alarm. The system had detected that he had received another complaint, and now a bonus awaited him. Its mechanical voice sounded with that special solemnity with which rewards are announced for feats no one asked to perform. It was simply excellent news, and in that simple statement one could hear not so much joy as the relief of a man who was accustomed to luck coming to him in the most unexpected forms. The owner's wishes for a limited edition luxury car that looked like a regular car, intended to be used as a taxi driver, were answered, as if the system itself had finally grasped his paradoxical nature. He needed to pick it up from the underground parking lot where it had been waiting, hidden from prying eyes, like a secret weapon. Yang Chen thanked the system for its care, and his words didn't sound like flattery, but rather like genuine surprise at how oddly chance and calculation were intertwined in his new life. Now he could go home and rest. The thought of silence and solitude suddenly seemed almost a luxury to him, more valuable than any bonuses. He walked to Villa number 1, and every step along the gravel path filled his chest with a strange feeling like anticipation. It was very cozy there. The silence enveloped him like a warm blanket, and the air smelled of the sea and freshness, as if nature itself had decided to give him a break. All this time, he was being watched from the balcony of a neighboring villa, and the shadow that flashed in the semi-darkness seemed to be part of some silent performance. It was the owner of Villa number 8, Shui Yinong, and her gaze revealed not just simple curiosity, but the keen interest of someone accustomed to solving riddles. She asked the servants to find out about the owner of Villa number 1. And this assignment was not idle chatter, but cold calculation, disguised as social curiosity. She learned that he was young, but drove an ordinary car and did not at all look like a rich man. This discrepancy intrigued her like a puzzle piece that just wouldn't fit into place. The girl thought that he might have been from one of the large families, and this thought brought her a strange satisfaction. It was easier to explain what did not fit into the usual framework. She asked Aunt Lan to take 2 bottles of wine and pay him a visit to let him know that they were at the 8th villa, a gesture that was a subtle play, where politeness was just an elegant wrapper for more serious intentions. She did so, and her steps along the path sounded almost like a sentence passed in advance. When Yang Chen opened the door, the manager of Villa number 8 stood at the threshold, her restrained smile seeming both friendly and inscrutable. She handed him a small gift as a new neighbor, and the rustling of the wrapping paper sounded in the silence like a promise of something more than just politeness. Yan asked her employer's name, and she, in turn, asked the young gentleman's name, an exchange of questions reminiscent of a cautious testing of the waters before a serious conversation. He invited the manager to visit, but she refused, and in her refusal one could hear not coldness, but the trained restraint of a person who knows her limits. She wished him a good rest, and the simple words sounded like a blessing, unexpectedly warm in the cool of the evening. When she returned, Shui Yinong asked how it had gone, and her voice carried the tension of someone waiting for a solution. Lan was sure that Yang Chen was very good, and would definitely come back soon for a return visit, and in this confidence there was an almost maternal faith in the best. Now it was time for everyone to rest, and the silence that descended on the village seemed almost tangible. It was 10 o'clock in the evening, and the dark sky, strewn with stars, seemed to invite reflection. Jan decided it was too early to sleep and wanted to go for a walk. That restless energy had suddenly awakened in him, which did not allow him to sit still even when his body begged for rest. His car drove down the dark street, cutting through the darkness with its headlights, and this narrow corridor of light seemed like a road into the unknown. A new challenge led him to a movie theater, and the neon sign, flickering in the darkness, beckoned like a beacon to weary travelers. A couple was already waiting for him near the building, and their silhouettes in the light of the lanterns looked almost theatrical. Getting into the car, the girl said that she was a student and asked to be taken to the dormitory by 10:30, and in her voice one could hear not just a request but a plea for salvation from the impending disaster. But judging by the navigator, their journey should have taken about 20 minutes, and this figure hung in the air like a death sentence. The young man also asked that the girl be taken to the hostel by this time, since it was closing later, although it was clear that if they had gone to the hotel with her, he would have been very pleased. His words were permeated with that special masculine annoyance, mixed with impotence. Yang Chen promised to do his best and stepped on the gas, the engine giving off a low, confident growl. And his car rushed forward, cutting through the night like a blade cuts through water. The passenger said that if the driver didn't deliver them on time, they wouldn't pay, and he'd have to take them back. And the threat sounded less like greed than like the nervousness of someone who had put too much on one card. The girl was frightened by these words, and her gaze darted to the window, as if she was looking for a way to salvation there. But the boy said he did it on purpose to make the driver go faster, and his grin showed that boyish mischief that often masks fear. But Yan Chen knew a shortcut to this university and promised to take him there in 15 minutes, since he was from there himself, and in this simple admission one could hear a quiet pride in his knowledge of the city. Hearing this, the girl was very surprised. She didn't even think that the driver would be one of the senior students, and her surprise was tinged with almost childish admiration. Suddenly the system announced that they had deviated from the assigned route, and this mechanical voice sounded in the cabin like an uninvited judge. The boy started shouting where they were going and why they were off course, and his voice rang with tension like a taut string. Yang Chen explained that they were simply taking a shortcut to save time, and his calm demeanor conveyed the confidence of a man who knew what he was doing. Lin Xiaoyu even asked for his contact information so she could contact him directly next time, since he really knew all the roads here, and this request was not just about convenience, but a desire to find at least one reliable landmark in this chaotic world. Their car slowed down right in front of the dormitory, and this perfect maneuver sounded like the final chord in their little race against time. The girl hurried out, and her light steps on the asphalt sounded like the beating of a heart counting down the last seconds of freedom. She started shouting at the commandant not to close the door, and she was already running inside, and her silhouette dissolved in the opening, like a mirage disappearing with the dawn. The girl waved goodbye to them, and this simple gesture suddenly acquired a special warmth, as if she was thanking them not only for the trip, but for helping her win this little battle. Turning to the passenger, Yang Chen asked where he wanted to be taken, and in this mundane question, one could hear the desire to quickly close this chapter. The guy said he would make a repeat order, and the driver would only have to accept it, and there was something deliberately casual about his words, as if he was trying to hide his disappointment. A new notification popped up on Yan Chen's mobile phone, and the cold blue light from the screen momentarily illuminated his face from the darkness. Most likely, he also placed the first order, and this guess fell on his shoulders like a heavy burden, foreshadowing trouble. Suddenly, the system alerted him to another bad review, and as a reward, he received a real martial arts skill that took effect immediately. This information hit him like a lightning bolt, changing the rules of the game right on the fly. Yang Chen felt that this technique had some kind of superpower, and a strange, almost electrical energy suddenly appeared in his muscles, as if his body itself knew how to use it. Turning to the passenger, he asked why he had left a bad review when he had dropped off his girlfriend on time. And his question did not sound offensive, but rather the cold bewilderment of a man accustomed to playing by the rules. And he replied that he would only tell them about it when they got there, and in his voice one could hear that special heaviness that appears when words become a weapon. After the car stopped at the right place, Yang Chen asked again about the bad review, and the silence that hung in the car became almost palpable. Instead of answering, he called his friends, and this gesture sounded louder than any words. They rushed at the car with batons in their hands, and the metal groaned under the blows like a living creature defending its owner. Yang Chen asked the passenger what he meant by that, and in his calm question one could hear an attempt to find at least a drop of common sense in this madness. He was furious, because he had spent the whole day with the girl, putting off this moment, and now the anger that had been building up for hours burst out in an uncontrollable stream. But Yan remembered that the guy himself had asked to take him there and make it before the right time, and this simple logic suddenly seemed like the only island of reason in this storm of emotions. The young man cursed under his breath, and this rough sound sounded like an admission of his own powerlessness. After all, the driver had ruined his day, and in this phrase one could hear not so much Jan's guilt, but rather the bitter realization that the world did not revolve around his desires. The boy was furious, and Yang Chen remembered that he had just mastered a combat technique, so perhaps he could handle several bandits. This thought brought him a strange, almost cold satisfaction. Several people were already waiting for him on the street, and their dark silhouettes merged with the night, becoming part of its predatory shadow. But he calmly asked the guy to wait, and there was such confidence in his voice that even the attackers froze for a moment. He decided that Ian was afraid of them and shouted at him to get down on his knees and apologize, and in this demand there was a desire to regain control at any cost. Yang Chen calmly replied that it wasn't a good idea for them to start such a fight in front of the cameras. It would have been better to go to some dark alley. His words didn't sound like a concession, but like the cold calculation of a strategist choosing a battlefield. The guy decided that the driver had resigned himself to his fate. And in this illusion, he could hear his own need to believe that everything was going according to his plan. And they obediently followed Yan Chen to a place where there were no cameras, and their every step sounded like a countdown to the inevitable denouement. At one point, the driver stopped abruptly and turned around. The movement was so sudden that the night seemed to stumble over his resolve, and the air thickened with tension, foreshadowing a storm. And then the sounds of blows were heard, short, sharp, like the cracking of branches breaking on a frosty night. They merged into an ominous rhythm that would have frozen the blood in anyone else's veins. Ian was able to quickly knock out all of the attackers. His movements weren't just precise. They seemed like an extension of the darkness itself, merging with it and becoming an invisible weapon. They began to complain that they had been knocked out with one blow, and their groans sounded not so much like pain as resentment at the fact that their strength was powerless against someone else's technology. The guy himself didn't know that the person in front of them was a martial arts master, and now this ignorance looked like a fatal mistake for which he had to pay in full. Yang Chen walked up to the car, his steps on the asphalt sounding calm, as if nothing special had happened, as if he had just returned from a casual walk. And he called to this poor fellow whose voice had recently rung with rage, but now trembled with fear. And he began to shout that he had already learned his lesson, and that there was no point in beating him anymore. And in this shout, one could hear not bravado, but naked, undisguised panic. But he replied that he was not going to touch him anymore, and his words did not sound kind, but rather the icy indifference of a man who had already passed his sentence. And now this guy owed Yan a new car. The phrase sounded not like a threat, but like a dry fact, as if they were talking about returning a forgotten item. Having said this, the driver pressed the gas pedal, and the car rushed forward, leaving behind dust, resentment, and an absurd scene that now seemed like a bad dream. Lin Xiaoyu called Yang's phone and asked if he had dropped her boyfriend off, and her voice sounded less like worry and more like a vague premonition that the familiar world had cracked. Well, he replied that several people wanted to beat him up, so he had to push him, and he also advised the girl to break up with this man. His words did not sound like an intervention, but like a bitter truth that is difficult to hear but impossible to ignore. Lin Xiaoyu called the guy's phone, and that call became the spark that would either ignite the flame or extinguish it forever. And she asked why he wanted to beat up their driver, and the silence that hung on the phone was louder than any scream. As it turned out, he was jealous of her because she flirted with this driver in front of him, and this simple, almost childish reason suddenly made the whole situation absurdly tragic. Hearing this, the girl thought that he had gone crazy, and there was no anger or resentment in this thought, only a cold, sobering realization that next to her was a man she did not know. The guy turned off his phone, and this abrupt break in communication sounded like the final verdict, putting an end to their story. A second later, he decided to write a complaint against Yan Chen, and his fingers, trembling with anger, quickly typed the words that were supposed to be his revenge. As a reward for this, the system gave Ian the opportunity to strengthen his body. It offered him the power to reshape the very physics of his existence and demanded only one thing: a signal when he was ready to accept this gift. This complaint was another great gift for him, and the irony of the situation made Jan smile faintly. The world was once again paying him for the mistakes of others. Yang Chen arrived at his villa, and the familiar outlines of the house suddenly seemed to him not just a refuge but an arena where a new chapter would begin. And he gave the system a signal that he was ready to strengthen his body, and this simple gesture was akin to jumping into icy water. He knew that there would be no turning back. The process was launched, and the air around him seemed to thicken, filling with energy that was looking for an outlet. In 7 seconds, it was all over. He was now the most powerful man on Earth, and that power didn't scream or flash, but quietly pulsated inside, like a dormant volcano, ready to awaken at any moment. Suddenly, Yang Chen sensed a stench, and this smell, sharp and unpleasant, hit his nostrils, as if nature itself was protesting against such rapid changes. This was the legendary meridian cleansing, an ancient, almost mystical process that pushed out all that was superfluous from the body to make room for new power. The next day, a new life began for him, and the dawn that painted the sky scarlet seemed to symbolize this transition. In the morning, John went for a run, and every step he took along the path now sounded different, clear, confident, like the gait of a man who had become reacquainted with his body. And I met Mrs. Yeo, and her silhouette in the morning light seemed almost unreal, as if she was part of this new day. He thanked her for the gift, and in these words one could hear not formal politeness, but sincere gratitude for the thread of human warmth that connected them. And he wished her luck at her morning training, and his wish sounded not like an empty phrase, but like a silent recognition of her strength and perseverance. Jan began to think about what he should give his neighbor in return, and in this simple desire there was a desire not to remain in debt, to maintain the fragile balance between them. And then he remembered the tea, that very same rare, almost priceless one, which smelled of centuries and secrets, and which now seemed like the perfect gift. He rang Ju's doorbell, and the short ring sounded like the beginning of something new that he couldn't fully comprehend yet. The manager opened the door, and he bowed his head slightly and said that he didn't want to come empty-handed, a gesture that wasn't ostentatious politeness, but a sincere desire to repay the warmth shown to him. So he brought tea to share with them, and the bundle in his hand seemed almost like a sacred gift, as if he were passing on not just leaves, but a piece of some ancient secret. The manager was very surprised. Her eyebrows rose slightly, and in her eyes there flashed that special curiosity that appears when you encounter something that does not fit into the usual framework. At that moment, the villa's owner emerged from the shower and, seeing the guest, with a light, almost casual gesture, asked Aunt Lan to treat him to some wine. Her manner conveyed the confidence of a woman accustomed to managing not only the home, but also the expectations of others. The manager said that a young Chen had brought tea so they could brew it, and there was an almost tremulous anticipation of something unusual in her words. The girl approved of this choice and asked to boil water, and in this simple request, her inner craving for everything mysterious and rare suddenly emerged. But Ian said he wouldn't stay for tea because he needed to hurry and pick up his car. And there was no coldness in his voice, but an iron necessity to follow his own rhythm, which did not tolerate delays. Hearing this, Jue asked him what he did for a living, and the question sounded not out of idle curiosity, but as an attempt to put together the scattered pieces of a puzzle. And he replied that he worked as a taxi driver, and these words hung in the air, as if deliberately violating all her ideas about what the owner of a luxury villa should look like. Hearing this, the girl even thought that he might not be a rich man, and this thought brought her a strange, almost bitter relief. It was easier to explain what did not fit into the usual patterns. Aunt Lan asked if the hostess knew what kind of tea it was, and there was an almost superstitious respect for the unknown in her voice. But she too was seeing it for the first time, so she asked that these leaves be taken to old Hung for him to look at. This decision reflected the wisdom of a person who knows that there is knowledge that is inaccessible even to the most insightful. She did so, and her quiet steps down the corridor sounded like a promise to reveal some important secret. But then Jue couldn't understand how a taxi driver could afford Villa number 1, and this inconsistency gnawed at her from the inside, not giving her any peace for a second. Meanwhile, young Chen arrived at his new address, and the sudden transition from the cozy atmosphere of the villa to the everyday bustle of the street hit his nerves like an ice shower. There was already a client waiting for him there, and her impatient movements betrayed a person who was used to the world, adapting to her schedule. He asked if she had ordered a taxi, and his calm voice sounded like an anchor in this sea of vanity. The girl asked why he had switched to such an ordinary car, and her question sounded less like curiosity, and more like the slight disappointment of a man who had expected more. After all, she believed that he should drive a sports car or something like that, and this confidence of hers was akin to faith in the immutable laws of the universe. Miss Zhang asked if her legs had become longer since she had dressed up, and the flirtatious question had that special feminine game that is both disarming and challenging. Ian replied that she could score 99 if she didn't talk, and 59 if she did, and this dry assessment sounded like a sentence delivered without anger, but with merciless precision. And then he briefly told her to fasten her seatbelt, and in this command one could hear not rudeness, but concern, hidden behind a steel shell of professionalism. She'd made reservations at Queen Mary's to invite him to dinner that evening, but Yang Chen told her to forget about it because he still had to pick up the car. His refusal sounded less like an insult than a statement of a fact that couldn't be changed. Yang was sure that Miss Zhang wanted to get him drunk and take him to a hotel, but she really didn't mind, and her agreement was not so much treachery as a desperate desire to break out of the routine. But the driver firmly replied that he didn't want to have dinner, and in these words one could hear not coldness, but a firm knowledge of his boundaries. She was a sweet, beautiful, long-legged girl with a great mind and a thin waist, and he refused to have dinner with her. This inconsistency seemed so absurd that the girl even wondered if he had problems with his sexual orientation, and this thought flashed through her head like a random spark, immediately extinguished by its own absurdity. Ian slammed on the brakes and said they were there. If she had nothing else to say to him, she could just get out, and in that dry phrase there was a desire to close this chapter as quickly as possible. As she stepped out of the car, she was certain that there was something truly wrong with this guy, and this certainty gave her a strange, almost unsettling satisfaction. John arrived for a new order, and the city once again drew him into its endless rhythm where every second counted. The girl waved her hand at him, and this simple gesture suddenly seemed to him like a distress signal, disguised as ordinary haste. But some guy wouldn't let her pass, demanding money, and his rough voice cut the air like a knife, revealing the ugliness of the situation. He was sure she had knocked over the bicycles that had fallen on his car and scratched it, and his accusations sounded less like a thirst for justice than a need to vent pent-up anger. Hearing this, Jan suggested going to the neighboring building and looking at the surveillance cameras. And this suggestion sounded like the calm confidence of a man who knows the value of evidence. The girl was very happy about this, and her eyes flashed with hope for a moment, as if she saw a way out of the trap. The guy saw that John's car had temporary license plates and realized that the car was new, and this detail suddenly made the driver in his eyes not just a witness, but a potential victim. He advised him to mind his own business until his new car was damaged, and the threat was tinged with the familiar arrogance of a man accustomed to having his word as law. Yang Chen calmly replied that such a tall man should not bully a little girl, and there was no bravado in his words, only a cold statement of injustice. But he angrily replied that it was none of his business, and in this sharp refusal, one could hear a readiness to defend his rightness at any cost. This was Jan's client, and he didn't really want to be detained, but his sense of duty to his passenger warred with his desire not to get involved in someone else's drama. But he grabbed the club, and the metal clanged dully, reminding him that the threat had become tangible. The guy started shouting that he had the courage to smash the car, and in his shout you could hear that special excitement that appears when a person decides to prove to himself that he is stronger. Jan stepped aside so as not to interfere, but the main thing was that he had money to repair it. This dry logic contained the bitter wisdom of a man who had too often seen how other people's emotions ruined other people's lives. The guy laughed that it was just a cheap car, and in that dismissive laugh there was a desire to devalue what could have been a real loss for someone else. But the girl screamed at him not to drag others into their affairs, and her voice sounded less like a defense of Jan than a desperate attempt to bring the situation back into the framework of at least some logic. Chen told her not to stop him, and the phrase didn't sound aggressive, but rather calmly confident in his right to defend himself. After all, he had dealt with such bastards before, and bitter experience had taught him that sometimes the only way to stop violence is to show that you are not afraid of it. The girl began to apologize for dragging the driver into this situation, and her apologies did not sound weak, but rather genuinely hurt that her problems had become someone else's. But he replied that she shouldn't worry about it, and in this simple consolation there suddenly appeared that rare humanity that is so easy to lose in a big city. The guy was shouting that if he didn't smash this car, he would always be ashamed of himself, and in this shout one could hear not so much a threat as the desperation of a man driven into a corner by his own pride. But as soon as he raised his club, he noticed something. That very moment of insight flashed in his eyes when reality suddenly becomes too heavy for the usual illusions. If things had turned out differently, he would have done things he could not pay for, and this simple, bitter truth suddenly cooled his rage. Jan noticed that he had stopped and shouted at him to continue, a challenge that was not meant to be cruel, but rather a desire to bring the situation to its logical conclusion, so that there would be no more unspoken agreement. The boy dropped the bat and quietly said that he had misunderstood him, and in this admission there was no capitulation but a rare moment of recognition of his own mistake. And most likely, the wind was to blame for the fall of the bicycles, and this ridiculous version suddenly became the very bridge that allowed everyone to save face. But Jan insisted that he had hit the car and was proud of himself, and in this persistence one could hear not a thirst for revenge, but a desire to prevent a lie from becoming the truth. The guy kindly asked them to get into the car, and this sudden politeness sounded almost like an apology disguised as ordinary courtesy. Chen told the girl to get into the car, and his voice sounded like a command returning the world to its usual tracks. The girl thanked the driver for saving her from trouble, and in her gratitude one could hear not just politeness but deep relief mixed with amazement. But she didn't understand why this guy had suddenly become so kind, and this question was tinged with that childish bewilderment that appears when the world suddenly turns out to be more complicated than you thought. Chen shrugged and said that perhaps it was just his mood swings, and in that simple phrase his entire philosophy of life suddenly emerged to accept the world as it is, without unnecessary drama. They arrived at their final destination, and the silence that fell on the plain seemed almost blessed after all the chaos. The girl said her name was Zhao Yun, and that she had come here at the invitation of her neighbor for dinner. She asked if the driver would like to join them, and the invitation conveyed more than just politeness, but a genuine desire to share the warmth of someone else's home. But he kindly refused, and in this refusal there was neither arrogance nor disdain, only a calm knowledge of his limits. Zhao Yun asked for his phone number so she could call him directly next time to order a car, and this request was filled with an almost childish desire to find at least one reliable point of support in this huge city. So they exchanged phone numbers, and this simple exchange of numbers suddenly took on special significance, as if they had entered into an unspoken agreement of mutual assistance. And then he got in and drove in the other direction, and the city swallowed his car like a wave swallows a pebble, leaving behind only a slight ripple. In the car, John realized that he was a little hungry, and this simple, almost mundane realization suddenly seemed like a real miracle to him, a sign that life goes on no matter what. He pulled up to the first diner he came to, and the neon sign blinking in the twilight beckoned like a beacon to a weary traveler. Once inside, he asked the girl to take his order, and the ordinary ritual of ordering food suddenly took on a special value for him as a symbol of the normal, calm life that he so rarely allowed himself to live. He sat down at the table to wait, and the silence around him seemed almost tangible, as if the world had stopped for a moment, giving him a short respite. Suddenly, a message from Zhao Yun arrived on his phone. She wrote that she was in room 302, that she might have been drugged, and she was asking for help. These words struck his nerves like an electric shock, instantly erasing all illusion of peace. Ian returned to the place where he had dropped her off, and every step he took now sounded like a countdown to the inevitable denouement, where not just a reputation was at stake, but someone's life. At the reception, he asked the girl to go up to the room and check the situation there, and his voice did not sound like a request, but rather like a steely order that could not be ignored. She went to room 302, but suddenly Jan saw a familiar face. It flashed in the opening of the stairs, like a ghost from the past, from which it was impossible to hide. His old friend, the Brute, was coming down the stairs, and behind him they were leading Zhao Yun, and her drooping figure in the clutches of the kidnappers seemed especially fragile against the backdrop of brute force. The girl asked to let her go, and these words, barely audible, scratched the soul like nails on glass. Ian hit the table with all his might, and the wood groaned under his fist like a living creature sharing his rage. And he flew under the feet of the kidnapper, turning into an improvised obstacle, a symbol of rebellion against injustice. Zhang Hengji certainly didn't expect to meet Yan Chen here. That moment of shock flashed in his eyes when reality suddenly collapses under the weight of an unexpected encounter. But he didn't want to get involved with him that day, and this thought flashed through his head like a fleeting regret that fate was once again throwing him a test that he hadn't sought. But Jan resolutely stopped them, and his figure, frozen in the path, seemed indestructible, like a rock blocking a stormy stream. Turning to the girls, he asked if they were roommates and what they were doing with Zhao Yun, and this question sounded not just curious, but a cold test of the strength of their lies. But they started saying that she had simply had a lot to drink, and that they were helping her get to the dorm, and their words crumbled into thin air like a cheap house of cards that couldn't withstand the pressure of the truth. It was unclear then why the girl had sent him such a message, and this inconsistency hung in the air like a toxic fog, poisoning trust. This was something the kidnappers hadn't expected, and their eyes flashed with the panicked realization that their carefully crafted plan had fallen apart. They started shouting that it was all slander, and that Zhang Hengji was actually her boyfriend. And these excuses sounded less like defense than like a desperate search for salvation. To clarify all the circumstances, Jan decided to call the police, and this simple gesture sounded like a death sentence, completely depriving them of any chance to get out of it. Zhang Hengji began to shout that he was deliberately trying to make things difficult, and his voice rang with tension like a taut string about to snap. And suddenly he started running, and his rapid dash looked like an attempt to escape not only from the police, but also from his own guilt. One of the girls followed him, screaming that she had nothing to do with it, and her words sounded like a plea for forgiveness that no one was likely to grant her. Yang Chen picked up Zhao Yun, and her body, limp from fear and the effect of the substance, lay in his arms like a fragile bird in need of protection. She could barely speak and asked to be taken away from here, and in every word she said one could hear horror choking her throat. Yang Chen asked the waitress to open a separate room for him, and this request sounded not like a whim, but rather an urgent need to hide the girl from prying eyes. He quickly carried the girl there, and his every step was filled with determination to protect her from further shocks. Zhao Yun thanked him for saving her, her trembling lips barely able to speak the simple words that seemed like the most important thing in the world at that moment. Having handed the girl a glass of water, he asked what she was doing there, and in this calm question one could hear a desire to unravel the tangle of events before the threads became completely tangled. It turned out that her roommates, Wang Lan and Chang Yafei, had said they wanted to invite her to dinner, But when she arrived at the room, she found that Zhang Hengji was there too. She was about to leave, but he told her she needed a glass of juice before going, and after that she felt dizzy. This story, told through tears and trembling, sounded like a nightmare scenario that no one would want to experience. Jan asked why she drank the juice in the first place, and there was no judgment in the question, only a bitter incomprehension of how easy it is to become a victim of someone else's game. The girl jumped up and began shouting that she would call the police, and in her sudden determination one could hear the awakening of a strength that had previously been drowned out by fear and confusion. Ian pulled out his phone because they couldn't let the bad guys get away with it, and the cold screen in his hand felt like a weapon that could restore justice. Soon a police car pulled up, its flashing lights cutting through the darkness like swords revealing the truth. This time Zhang Hengji wouldn't get off so easily, and there was no malice in that thought, but a cold satisfaction that justice had finally caught up with the culprit. When Jan arrived at the villa, the manager of the 8th villa was already waiting for him, and her reserved posture betrayed a person accustomed to carrying out orders on which much depended. He asked what she was doing there, and in that simple question one could hear the weariness of a man who had been balancing on the edge for too long. She said that my lady wanted to invite him for a cup of tea, and her words were almost ritually polite, concealing much more serious intentions. But he refused under the pretext of fatigue, and postponed the meeting until dinner the next day. And in this refusal one felt not coldness, but a need to catch his breath. Aunt Lan promised to prepare some dishes, and her smile showed anticipation, as if this dinner was going to be more than just a meal. She told the hostess about their conversation, and every word fell on the table, like a chip in a complex game where the stakes grew with every minute. The girl was surprised that he refused her invitation, because many were just waiting for this. And in her surprise, one could hear not so much disappointment, but the excitement of a hunter who was challenged. But she happily agreed to pay him a visit herself, and this decision was marked by that special feminine confidence that does not tolerate refusal. A little later, Zhao Yun called Yan Chen again, and the sound of her voice on the phone was like an echo of a recent nightmare. She said the police blamed her neighbor for everything, but Yang promised to help her punish Zhang Hengji, and this promise did not sound like empty bravado, but a firm intention to see the matter through to the end. The next day, he arrived for a new order, and the city again drew him into its endless cycle, where every minute was worth its weight in gold. As his passengers boarded the plane, he asked them to fasten their seat belts, and this familiar ritual suddenly took on a special significance, like the boundary between the ordinary and danger. Suddenly, one of his passengers took off his shoes, and the entire interior of the car was filled with an incredible, terrible stench that penetrated under the skin, making you cringe in disgust. Ian asked him to put his boot back on and buckle up, and there was a final warning in his voice that something more was to come. But he replied that he was very tired and wanted to take a nap, and that this taxi driver had too many rules. And this casual phrase revealed the usual arrogance of a man who believes that the world should adapt to his comfort. Ian insisted that he put on his shoes or he would have to get out of the car, and in this firmness one could hear not capriciousness, but a defense of his space, which he was not going to give up to be torn to pieces. The man started shouting that if he did, the driver would receive a negative review, and his threat was imbued with that special sense of impunity that comes with being confident that his word is law. His companion also began to express indignation that a person working in the service industry should not complain about foot odor, and in her words, one could almost hear contempt for those who dare to put their feelings above the comfort of others. But Yang Chen wasn't going to back down, because he was a driver, not a massage therapist, and he wasn't going to tolerate that stench, and in that simple truth his whole philosophy of life suddenly became apparent, not to bend to other people's whims. The man stated that he was not going to go anywhere, and that the driver could not do anything to him. Then Jan himself stepped out of the car, and his movements were not abrupt, but measured like the steps of a predator going out to hunt. He walked up to the passenger door, and the silence around him became almost palpable. as if the world had frozen in anticipation of the outcome. He grabbed the man by the hand, and the grip of his fingers was iron, leaving no chance for resistance. And with one movement, he threw him out into the street, and this gesture sounded like a final verdict, depriving the opponent of the right to further claims. The girl in the car started screaming and calling for help, and her voice cut through the air like a blade, revealing the absurdity of the situation. A crowd of onlookers had gathered around them. She was begging them to restore justice, since the driver had insulted them and hit her boyfriend. And in her pleas, there was a desperate attempt to regain control of what was happening. But young Chen said that it was slander and that it all started because of foot odor, and his calm voice sounded like that special confidence that comes when you know for sure that you are right. People stood up for the driver, and this unexpected turn of events suddenly showed that justice sometimes finds allies where it is least expected. People started talking about the taxi driver's luxury car, and a whisper of curiosity swept through the crowd like a wave changing the balance of power. It was only later that the passenger noticed the car, and the realization hit him like a slap in the face, forcing him to take a fresh look at the man he had just tried to humiliate. He told his companion that they were in trouble because the car cost $1 million, which meant the driver was some wealthy person, and in this confession there was a bitter understanding that they had crossed the wrong person. Zhao Yu began apologizing to Yang Chen and even offered to treat him to food, and her embarrassment was tinged with a sincere desire to somehow smooth over the awkwardness. She said that the man could return without her, and this phrase sounded like a final decision to break off contact with the one who had just put her in a humiliating position. But he was not happy with this situation, and in his stubbornness one could hear the resentment of a man who was used to being the main one in any game. The girl continued to insist on her own, and her firmness suddenly became the very force that could change the course of events. Since they were well acquainted, Yang asked Zhao Yu to remove the stinking shoes from the car, and this request did not sound like humiliation, but a simple desire to restore human dignity to the interior. She quickly threw them out into the street, and this sharp gesture sounded like a symbolic deliverance from everything unpleasant that had happened during the day, and she sat back down and was ready to go to dinner. And her determination showed a desire to regain control of at least this part of the evening. Yang Chen got behind the wheel and thanked her, and in those simple words there was a sincere appreciation for her understanding. Then he asked her to get out and wipe the rearview camera. And in this everyday request, his pedantry, bordering on an obsession with order, suddenly appeared. She happily agreed to help him, and her willingness showed an almost childish desire to be useful, to somehow make amends for the guilt. But as soon as she got out, Yang Chen pressed the gas pedal, and the car rushed forward, leaving the girl standing in the middle of the street, not even having time to realize what had happened. Her handbag flew out of the car next, and this casual gesture sounded like a final farewell, devoid of any sentimentality. The guy couldn't help but laugh at the situation, and his laughter was a mixture of relief and cynical pleasure at someone else's failure. Zhao Yu slapped him, and the sharp sound sounded like a gunshot, ending their relationship. She started screaming at him for being stupid, for not understanding why she was doing it, and in her anger you could hear the pain of someone whose good intentions had been cruelly mocked. Zhao Yu wanted to apologize to that driver with this dinner, and now her sincere gesture looked like a ridiculous joke that everyone laughed at. But now she was asking to leave a bad review for the driver and file a complaint, and this request was laced with a desperate desire to somehow restore justice, even if in such a primitive way. And the guy immediately started doing it, his fingers flying across the screen as if he wanted to erase Yan Chen from his reality. After their passengers, the first thing Jan did was go and clean the interior, and the smell of the air freshener, mixed with the remnants of the stench, seemed to him an almost sacred aroma of cleansing. And then the system notified him of a bad review and complaint, and the mechanical voice sounded like an ironic commentary on the drama that had just unfolded. For this, the system rewarded the owner with a 32% stake in the Bioking Hotel and $5 million in cash, making him the company's second-largest shareholder. He needed to contact the Bioking Hotel's headquarters to obtain an agreement to transfer the stake. And this news fell on him like an avalanche, changing his entire life with a single message. A cheerful Yang Chen asked if the system's rewards could compensate for the damage he suffered from his smelly feet. And this playful question suddenly revealed his ability to maintain his sense of humor, even in the most absurd situations. Suddenly, he received a message on his phone from Wang Lexin asking him to come to room 308 of the Baoking Hotel, and this unexpected call sounded like a new twist in a game whose rules he was only just beginning to understand. Yanchen was lucky again, and the thought flashed through his mind like a bright flash, promising new opportunities. When he arrived at his villa, he saw two cooks at the door, and their presence seemed like a fragment of some other, more luxurious life into which he had suddenly been led. He asked what they were doing there, and his question carried the slight bewilderment of a man who had not yet gotten used to the fact that the world had suddenly begun to play by his rules. It turned out that they came on Miss U's orders and were waiting for his return.